By the 1980s, the satanic horror movie that had been so prevalent through the 60s and 70s began to disappear. Instead, audiences were enjoying stories that were somewhat less spiritual and more visceral. Slashers, monster movies, and body horror had become the dominating trend of the era. However, horror filmmaker John Carpenter had other ideas, and despite actually pioneering the slasher subgenre with Halloween, Carpenter then turned to older, more classic horror formats. In 1987, he made Prince of Darkness, a film which brought the devil back to horror cinema, but also threw in a bit of classic Nigel Kneale-esque 50s sci-fi. Then a few years later, Carpenter drew on an even older tradition in horror with his existential mindfuck In the Mouth of Madness, a film clearly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. At the time, both Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness were financial flops, and both movies disappointed the slasher-hungry mainstream audiences of the time. It's only after some time has passed that both films are being reassessed as horror classics, and the last two truly great horror movies that John Carpenter ever made. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the occult, and we discuss John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're listening for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one season at a time. We are currently in the middle of our occult series, in which we look back at the history of satanic, witchy, occulty horror movies, and we're now on part 13, in which, as the intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two back-to-back John Carpenter horror movies, Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness. These will both be spoilerific discussions. If you haven't seen these movies, I would urge you to check them both out before listening to our discussion. Let's get straight into it then. Joining me to discuss all things John Carpenter, there's nobody better I could have had for this particular discussion. He is a long-time friend of the podcast. He's been on a bunch of times, and he loves John Carpenter and these particular films, so much so that he's literally written the book on In the Mouth of Madness. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Michael Blyth. Hello.
Hello. Good to be back.
Lovely to have you here. So we have been talking about occult movies, and we're going to get into sort of occult stuff during this chat. But I guess I want to start off by asking you about John Carpenter himself, because we talked a little bit about this when we talked about slashers, but you've literally written the book on In the Mouth of Madness. So I wanted to ask you first of all, what is it about that movie and also John Carpenter in particular that kind of spurred you to want to do that?
I mean, like millions of horror fans out there, John Carpenter is one of the greats,
really
one of my favourites. And I think with John Carpenter, there's just something, there's a kind of quality to his films, there's a strangeness to his films, there's a pace and a tone to his films that is like no one else. Mm-hmm. I think something also about John Carpenter that means horror fans have this kind of affection for him and are kind of drawn to him is the way that quite often his movies were kind of dismissed when they were first released. Yeah. So I think throughout his career, through Halloween, The Thing, moving forward to things like The Fog, Prince of Darkness, these are all films that are kind of horror classics now, but they were really dismissed at the time by critics and by the kind of establishment.
Yes.
And there's a kind of sense of him being slightly misunderstood and slightly not taken as seriously as he kind of should be. And I think the times have changed, and I think there's a lot of wrongs that have been rewritten over the course of time. But I think there are still some of his films that people don't respect or don't talk about with the same kind of gravitas that they do with some of the others. So for me, he's a genius.
Yeah, he really is. There's a kind of there's a sort of economy to all of his films as well that I love as well. They kind of get the job done, don't they?
They get in and get out. I think there's some. I think actually just rewatching kind of Prince of Darkness for this podcast, and obviously we'll talk about this a bit more later. But I mean, what a strange film that is!
It really
what
weird.
A strange piece of storytelling that is. And I think in some ways, Prince of Darkness is like the kind of crystallizes all the weirdest things about John Carpenter and puts them into one strange movie.
Absolutely. And, these two movies we're going to discuss are kind of what a lot of people consider the end of the kind of peak of his career, I suppose. What do you think of, how his career, the trajectory, I suppose, of his career and what he's been up to these last 20 years in comparison to the sort of 70s and 80s?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that general kind of consensus that from the kind of 90s onwards was the kind of decline of John Carpenter. And I think that is true to a certain degree. I mean, there's films within there that I love. I mean, In the Mouth of Madness is my favourite. I absolutely love it. That was 1994. So, I'm absolutely not dismissive of his 90s and onwards career.
But was that the last great movie he ever did, do you think?
I think In the Mouth of Madness was the last great one. I think there were some enjoyable ones since then.
Yeah.
I like Ghosts of Mars quite a lot. I've got a soft spot for vampires.
I quite like vampires.
Yeah, I think there's some good stuff in there. And, in terms of the kind of early 90s stuff, I also am quite a big fan of Body Bags. Which
I've not seen Body Bags.
Which I enjoy a lot. I think it's great. It's a kind of anthology, 3 stories, 2 of which Carpenter directed and one of which Tobe Hooper made. Yeah. And actually the Tobe Hooper one is the weak link, but the Carpenter stuff in there is super fun, and there's lots of stuff in Body Bags that themes that we see Carpenter kind of doing throughout his career, and there's a kind of fun playfulness in the way that he presents these ideas in this kind of short form anthology film.
Do you think, I mean, it may sound like a bit of an obvious question, I suppose, but how do you think you would describe a Carpenter film? Because it feels like he does have a certain amount of creative control over everything he does, because I feel like you can really tell a Carpenter film. He's not just like a kind of director for hire type, is he? No,
absolutely. And I think that's something, and I think maybe that's part of the reason why Prince of Darkness feels like, a kind of Carpenter plus film, because I think he'd had an experience in the 80s kind of working with studios and making kind of bigger budget films that had been quite unsuccessful critically and commercially quite unsuccessful sometimes as well. And I think Prince of Darkness was a kind of more of an independent production, was his chance to kind of get rid of the kind of input and the pressure from a kind of studio and to do the film that he really wanted to make. And you can see that film that he really wanted to make is a really weird, crazy film.
So weird,
But I think, like I said before, there's something, it's just about tone. I think that's what I always think about when I think of Carpenter's films. It's interesting to think about tone, because obviously music is such an important part of his films, and so often he does the music for his films.
Yeah,
so
the music is kind of such a kind of telling point, isn't it?
Exactly. So I think tone is the perfect word, because it encapsulates this idea of music and this idea of kind of sound, but also the kind of pacing and the kind of rhythm and the mood of his films, which is, it's often can almost seem flat. Yeah. It can often seem kind of unengaging, but I think there's a kind of register you have to adapt to sometimes with Carpenter, and once you get there, it becomes quite a kind of hypnotic experience watching his films.
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially with Prince of Darkness, actually, I really like the beginning of Prince of Darkness, which we'll get into, but there's a kind of, he builds a good feeling of kind of dread, and I think it's that music, it's that constant kind of pulsing music that you get throughout all of his films. It really builds this atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, but it's also the fact that the opening credits never seem to end. They go on for about 15 minutes, and it's almost like when it goes back to another set of kind of title cards, and you kind of laugh to yourself. Again, it's this thing of, it puts you in this really strange mindset, and I think there's something about this idea of being kind of hypnotized by his films, and hypnosis is achieved often through kind of repetition and repeated sounds or repeated images and stuff, and I think he does that a lot in his work. And I think particularly in Prince of Darkness, there's something about the music in those first 15 minutes. There's something about the way the credits appear that feels like it's kind of lulling you into this kind of sense of hypnosis, and it's highlighting you to the fact that what you're about to watch isn't going to be a conventional piece of kind of narrative horror cinema. I mean, obviously there's a strong narrative in there, but the way that it pans out, the emotional register of the characters, everything about it seems slightly off.
Yes, very much so. Do you I mean, you must have over the years, doing things like programming cult strands at LFF, I feel like he must be one of the most influential filmmakers now in the horror genre on kind of new generations. I mean, how many times have you met and spoken to filmmakers who sort of cite John Carpenter as an influence? Because I feel like his style, his music, his kind of vision, it pops up in every kind of new generation of horror filmmaker and cult filmmaker.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it'd be kind of bizarre to meet someone that didn't have Carpenter as a point of reference. I remember doing an interview a few years back with David Robert Mitchell around the release of It Follows.
Yes.
And I was kind of asking him about Carpenter, and there's something about that film which definitely feels kind of Carpenterian in the kind of music and the rhythm and the pace and that kind of thing. And he said to me, he was like, I wasn't thinking about Carpenter. I wouldn't say the film was directly kind of influenced by him in terms of something that as I was writing, as I was making it, I was referencing his films. But I guess his cinematic language is just infused in what I do.
Yeah.
And I think that's the case with a lot of kind of filmmakers, a lot of horror filmmakers. You know, his films are so iconic, and they're so distinctive in what they do that it's hard not to have that kind of permeate through into what you're creating. So, you know, even those filmmakers who might not explicitly think their films are kind of influenced by Carpenter, I don't see how any horror cinema past Halloween, past The Thing, past The Fog cannot be, you know, indebted to him in some way.
How do you think he compares to his contemporaries like Craven, Hooper, Romero, people like that?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think in terms of comparison, because I think each of them do something quite different. I mean, you know, Craven at his peak is, you know, was kind of commercial filmmaker, you know, and I think Craven occasionally, and I'm a big fan, I don't mean this to sound like I'm being dismissive, but I think sometimes Craven can feel a little bit more like a director for hire. I think Craven's kind of often his kind of less successful work is the work that's not written by him.
Yes.
I think, you know, when there's that kind of disconnect, I think it kind of shows, where I think with Carpenter, the work that's not written by him still always feels absolutely inherently like a John Carpenter film.
Yeah, I always think of Christine, because I know that he was very much a director for hire on Christine, and he kind of did that as a job. But it's like, it's so Carpenter, isn't it? You almost can't believe that wasn't written and created by him as well as directed, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, you know, there's something about Christine, the kind of coldness of Christine, and this kind of, again, it's the music. When I think about Christine, I always think about the music, and I think, you know, Christine makes a really interesting kind of partner film to Crash, Cronenberg's Crash. You know, when you're thinking about this kind of idea of the automobile, but this idea of isolation and disconnection and coldness, and you know, quite often in Carpenter's films it's like people walk around like they're zombies, and I think that kind of happens in Christine, and that is something that's in Crash as well. So there is something about kind of coldness and despair that's like inherent in his films, and you know, and I think it's quite different to Stephen King's novel, which you know, I think King is very kind sometimes with his characters, and he's very, you know, the way he writes people, I think, is you know, his characters are kind of engaging and emotionally engaging, whereas John Carpenter often seems a little bit less concerned with that. I think Christine makes leaps in terms of characters' narrative developments, which you kind of have to fill in yourself. You know, it doesn't matter so much exactly what people are doing. It's the space in which they're doing it that really matters.
I definitely think that with Prince of Darkness and with The Fog as well, he has a lot of like quite big ensemble casts a lot of the time, doesn't he, in his stories? I remember Chris Hewitt telling me from Empire, who came on the podcast to talk about how a lot of Carpenter films kind of are a little bit like is it Howard Hawks? The film, Howard Hawks, who kind of, you know, a big group of characters all kind of trapped in one kind of situation or whatever it might be, and how a lot of his films draw on that kind of theme.
And Carpenter always lists Howard Hawks as a direct influence on his work, and you know, Carpenter always talks about kind of a lot of classic Hollywood cinema, particularly thinking about, and also moving into kind of science fiction and westerns, and how kind of classical cinema and Hollywood cinema is a huge influence on him, on what he does. So, you know, it's interesting because we think about someone that is, you know, quite often John Carpenter is kind of ahead of his time, in the way that it takes people a while to catch up with him. Like I was saying, like critics dismissed him, and then years later people are saying, "Oh, The Thing's one of the great horror movies of all time." But at the time, it was completely panned. It was a huge failure, and it was a real knockback for him in terms of his career. But you know, he's not ahead of his time in the sense that he always does refer back to cinema that came before him. He's very open and very vocal about his influences. Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you a bit about, before we get into these two films specifically, the Apocalypse trilogy itself then. What is that, and when did that become a thing? Like, because obviously this is The Thing, followed by Prince of Darkness, and then In the Mouth of Madness. At what point, do you know, did this become a trilogy, or was it ever planned to be a trilogy? It was something that was kind of retroactively put together as a trilogy. It's a trilogy that exists in the same way. I think when I did the podcast with you about Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy, it really reminds me of that in a way. Yeah, exactly. So it's a thematic trilogy. It's not a trilogy that's linked directly in terms of story. You know, each of the films in the Apocalypse trilogy, which were The Thing in 1982, Prince of Darkness from 1987, and then In the Mouth of Madness in 1994. Each of them were written by different people. Each of them were produced by different studios. There's no crossover in terms of character, in terms of cast members, and each of them to a certain extent are quite different stylistically as well. but there's a kind of overarching theme, this theme of the apocalypse, this theme of the end of the world, which exists throughout. So much like the Gates of Hell trilogy is about the kind of undead or about a resurgence of evil, or, you know, you have something like Argento's Animal trilogy, which again, they're not kind of directly linked, but they work together and they complement each other to create one whole thing. So in terms of the Apocalypse trilogy, these are 3 films which are kind of essentially about the annihilation of human civilization through a variety of malevolent forces which come in. So we're not thinking about the apocalypse in terms of, you know, an atomic bomb, or, you know, a meteor crashing to the earth and destroying everyone, all life on this planet. It's about human life. It's about the destruction of human life, and it's kind of about the destruction of identity and the breakdown of individuality. So it's super nihilistic in the way that it kind of looks at the world, and you know, the way that it does it in these 3 films. In The Thing, you have these men in this kind of research facility in the Antarctic, and you have a kind of alien life form, which escapes from the ice essentially and inhabits these men and kind of takes them over, and it kind of turns each of these men into this kind of copy of themselves, like this kind of, you know, soulless blank version which the alien entity takes over. And then in Prince of Darkness, you've got a group of physics students who go to this church and find this kind of satanic goo. We'll talk about more about this in a minute, and kind of, you know, the kind of goo turns these people essentially into these zombie-like figures. And then in The Mouth of Madness, you've got this idea of a book or a writer whose prose is so potent that it infects society, infects those who read them. And, you know, there's this idea of kind of brainwashing throughout. So in each of them, it's about your body being taken over. It's about your body being inhabited by something else, and this idea of individuality breaking down, and suddenly the idea of rational thought and free will evaporates. And that's what John Carpenter's Apocalypse is. You know, it's not the end of the world so much as it's the end of humanity. Kind
of the end of freedom sort of thing.
Exactly. So actually, they're super kind of existential in the way that they think about the Armageddon. You know, it's this kind of existentialist, nihilist take on the end of the world, which works for me.
That's bloody great. Do you think is Carpenter in the same way as maybe Romero was? You know, is he a very political filmmaker? Because obviously he did things like They Live, which feels very much overtly kind of political. But what about this Apocalypse trilogy? Is there kind of political stuff going on there, or is he just telling good stories?
I mean, it's interesting. I don't really think about these films in that sense. I think, you know, there's a kind of socio-political context to these things, but I think it's much more kind of existential than it is political. I think, you know, his interest is in identity, is in individuality, in the kind of breakdown of that. So, you know, there's kind of political readings that you can take from those and from each of these films. But for me, that's not the kind of point of view that I take when I'm watching them. Yeah, exactly. Compared to some of his contemporaries, it doesn't seem to be at the forefront of a lot of his films as much. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff in there. It's interesting you mentioned They Live, because obviously They Live is very much a kind of attack on capitalism and consumerism and the way that we consume products, the way that we're being fed messages and stuff. And there is stuff that you can see from that in something like In the Mouth of Madness. Yes, which is about the kind of, you know, the business of horror to a certain extent. It's about, you know, this idea of kind of churning out this material that people consume and that actually kind of brainwashes them. And so this idea of kind of brainwashing is there and it is present. And, you know, these attacks on kind of capitalist, consumerist behaviour are things that we see throughout John Carpenter's work. I mean, we see it in Body Bags, in the story Hair. You know, again, there's this kind of quite comic take on John Carpenter's disdain for consumerist behaviours. Right. So I think you can read kind of political things into the works. How have you, before we get into the films, John, ask, have you ever met John Carpenter? Have you sort of had many dealings with him in person? I've not. I've never met him. No. I kind of don't want to. No, me neither. I kind of don't want to. I hear he's a bit grumpy. Grumpy? Yeah. Apparently he's a bit grumpy and he's a bit over talking about horror films that he's made. Yeah, exactly. And I want him to be lovely and to talk about horror movies. Yeah. So I think we're not really going to get anywhere. A couple of years ago, we did a restoration of The Fog in the London Film Festival, part of the kind of archive selection. And there was a brief moment in time when we thought maybe Carpenter might be around and that he could come. And I remember kind of thinking to myself, I hope he doesn't. But, you know, ultimately I would have wanted him to come. I would have wanted him to give him a copy of my book.
Yeah, that would have been amazing.
I think the idea that he would have just thrown it on the floor and walked away.
There is a little bit of kind of don't meet your heroes about John Carpenter, I think.
Which we will get to with the story of when John Carpenter met Nigel Neal.
Oh God, exactly.
Don't meet your heroes.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? And do you think he's over it now? I mean, is he ever going to direct another horror film ever again, do you think?
I can't imagine that he would.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love him to. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think that the last feature film that he made, The Ward, in many ways for me, kind of stylistically, feels like the least John Carpenter Carpenter film.
Yeah, definitely.
There was a sense of someone who was slightly over it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine that he would come back to it. And I think if he was going to come back to it with that same perspective, I could live without a new John Carpenter film. But, I'd love to see something that was a kind of throwback to the days of classic John Carpenter.
What did you think, just briefly to go off slightly, of the David Gordon Green Halloween? Because obviously Carpenter had a slight hand in that. He did the music for it. He very much kind of gave his stamp of approval on this particular Halloween sequel, didn't he?
Yeah, I wasn't a fan, I have to say. It didn't really work for me.
Yeah.
Too many men, too many middle-aged men, too many guns, too many police.
A lot of bros.
Yeah, it was a bit too kind of plotty, and I think there was something about the kind of, I think the beauty of Halloween is the simplicity.
Yes.
Again, the tone, this kind of mood, it's all about that, and I think that this new one overcomplicated things.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I think where it was at its best was in these kind of individual moments of tension. There was that kind of scene with the babysitter in the house, which is great. This is what I want.
Yeah.
But also for me, I thought that the kind of evolution of Laurie's character didn't really work for me in this new one. I think it turned her into this kind of Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 action figure. Whereas for me in Halloween H2O, this idea of Laurie, the trauma that she carries through her life, and she's now a kind of functioning alcoholic with a child who's just barely managing to keep things together and is kind of struggling through and using these crutches to kind of get by and to kind of hide from the horrors that she's experienced, was a much more convincing idea of what happens to you post-trauma, rather than that you're kind of stocked up with loads of guns and you're
setting booby traps in your basement.
Exactly. It just felt a little bit too. It felt a bit too like kind of Hollywoody.
It's going to be interesting to see what they do with the next two. Amazing. So let's get into it then. With all that in mind, let's start by discussing John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness from 1987.
Anyone in close proximity has the same dream.
What is it?
A secret that can no longer be kept. It started a month ago.
What started?
A change in the earth and the sky. His power.
There's a weird locking mechanism. Looks like it can only be opened from the inside.
A life form is growing out of prebiotic fluid. It's not winding down into disorder. It's self-organizing. It's becoming something. What?
So the story is basically, it begins with this old priest who dies and leaves behind this kind of this journal and this mysterious key.
Yes.
Both of which are collected by another priest, Father Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, who discovers that the key unlocks the basement to this abandoned church in LA. And within this basement, he finds this giant vial of mysterious kind of green swirling liquid. So from there he invites a physics professor who's his pal to come along to investigate, and the professor brings with him a group of students, and they eventually discover that the liquid that's contained within this canister is essentially the kind of essence of Satan, or I think actually the kind of essence of the son of Satan. And there's a lot of confusing plot points in Prince of Darkness, but eventually the kind of goo starts to spill out of this canister, which has been in there for like 2,000 years, and it infects the people who are there, the students and the people working there, and turns them into these kind of zombie-like killers, and eventually is kind of bent on and bringing forth this kind of demonic satanic presence back to Earth, who will destroy all of humanity.
There's a lot going on in this film for this like quite short film. What do you think of it, first of all? Are you a fan of this film?
I love it. I absolutely didn't love it when I first saw it. I remember seeing it when I was a kid. It was on TV and I turned it off. I was like, this is so
nonsense,
so boring. I remember thinking it was the most boring film I'd ever seen. And and I kind of had an awareness of John Carpenter. I'd seen a few and I was super excited, do that thing where you'd go through the TV guide every week when it came out and circle anything that was a horror movie, and I stayed up late to watch it. And for years I never went back to it. I always just assumed I didn't like it, based on my kind of 10-year-old self's opinion. And when I revisited it in my kind of early mid-20s, it was a completely new film to me. But I still didn't quite love it. There was something about it which I found quite difficult. And it's really over time that I've grown to love it more and more. I think Prince of Darkness is a film that you have to get used to.
I think that's true.
Before you fall in love with it. And I think that kind of fits in with this idea of, often John Carpenter's films, are kind of dismissed, or they're not kind of instantly loved and it takes a while. And I think with Prince of Darkness, that's kind of one of the only ones that makes sense to me, that it wouldn't work on the first time you watch it. I think there's there is something in there about the storytelling, about the performances, about the script, that it's almost like he's going out of his way to make this film as emotionally unengaging as he can. There's something about this idea that this film is about the kind of breakdown of, or the destruction of humanity and the destruction of individuality. It's kind of interesting that actually a lot of these characters from the beginning are quite kind of zombie-like. They're quite kind of uninteresting and unaffecting, and the way they deliver their dialogue is quite one note sometimes. Particularly Donald Pleasance in it, who, I'm not saying that he's zombie-like, he's very animated in the film, he's very passionate, but he's very one note throughout. There's no quite character arcs, there's no developments. People essentially end as they began. And quite often that's the case with the people that began as kind of regular and ended as like zombies. They kind of feel like the same person.
That's so true. And I think, like you said, it takes a while. It takes a few goes to watch it and appreciate it, maybe because initially you don't know what you're in for. And it really confused me as to what genre even this was. Is this a horror film? Is this science fiction? Is this some kind of satanic thing? Is it a slasher? It's kind of everything rolled into one, isn't it? And it's got all of these little individual elements. Let me start by asking you about Nigel Kneale then, because you mentioned this already. He John Carpenter wrote this, but he's credited as somebody Martin Quatermass, right? So tell me a little bit about that and what that means and what his relationship was with Nigel Kneale then.
So Nigel Kneale was a British writer, wrote some kind of really classic TV stuff, the Quatermass stuff.
He wrote the Stone Tape, which we've discussed.
Exactly, So John Carpenter is a huge Nigel Kneale fan. And, I think that the influence of Nigel Kneale, you can see it throughout a lot of John Carpenter's other work, particularly in The Thing. The Quatermass stories are about this alien entity arriving to Earth and kind of destroying man, and which is very much what The Thing is. But I think with Prince of Darkness, this was his most kind of explicitly Nigel Kneale film. This was Carpenter doing Nigel Kneale, and particularly in terms of the Stone Tape, I think there's a lot of parallels there in terms of this idea of a group of academics coming into a space to investigate the paranormal. And I think this kind of tension between science and the occult was something that Nigel Kneale was very, very interested in, and is really at the root of Prince of Darkness. Whereas actually what's really interesting about the Stone Tape, and what's particularly interesting about Prince of Darkness, is that actually these two things often aren't against each other. They're not fighting against each other. I think Prince of Darkness works in a world where science and religion are as important as each other, and actually they help each other to unlock the mysteries and the things that we don't understand about the other thing. Whereas I think quite often horror cinema kind of falls on one side or the other. So it's very dismissive and kind of discounts this idea of the supernatural, or it's invested completely in it. I think Prince of Darkness is kind of more complicated in this idea of kind of theory and theology and how they work together. So he came up with this kind of unsubtle name of Martin Quatermass as his pseudonym. Actually, he kind of went so far that he actually created a press pack for Prince of Darkness that had a biography for Martin Quatermass.
Brilliant.
I wrote down a little quote from it where it says, Prince of Darkness is his first screenplay, and he ensures all the physical principles used in the story, including the use of subatomic particles to travel backwards in time, are true. It also had a little thing about where he went to university, that he lives with his wife Janet somewhere.
I love it.
It was this full kind of commitment to this idea of being Martin Quatermass.
That is brilliant.
I think we see in Prince of Darkness, one of the characters describes how they came from Neil University. Yeah. He's wearing a Neil jumper at one point. And we see other Neil references in Carpenter's work in The Mouth of Madness. Hobbs End is also the name of, I think, the underground station in the Quatermass and the Pit.
Nice.
So, he often peppers his films with these little references, but, I think they're often much more than just kind of fanboy homages to someone that he really loves. I think they're indicative of how his films are infused with ideas and with, concerns that Neil had and things that really fed into his work. It's not just like a name check for the nerds in the audience to be like, oh, I know what that means. I think there's something about it. He puts in these little references as almost kind of keys to unlocking the mysteries of his own films, and how actually, if you go back to the Stone tape, you actually get a bit more insight into Prince of Darkness.
Interesting.
So I think there's something that's actually quite generous in the way that he does it. What's kind of super interesting here is that this came a few years after John Carpenter had a really difficult time with Nigel Neal, and we mentioned earlier about not meeting your heroes.
Yes.
Nigel Neal wrote the original screenplay for Halloween 3. He was approached to write it.
Because, of course, Halloween 3 is very Nigel Neal as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Completely crazy, nothing like the other ones. It's the one where Michael doesn't come home, obviously, and, he said that he had no interest in... He basically was approached to write Halloween 3, said that he had no interest in the Halloween films, hadn't seen them, thought they sounded rubbish, that he wanted to do something completely different. So he did that. He wrote a screenplay for it, which the studio, Dino De Laurentiis, wasn't really into. They thought it needed a bit less kind of chat and a bit more gore.
Yes.
And, there's a few things that John Carpenter talked about, he created a very British story which didn't really make sense to a lot of people, and wanted to make it more universal and understandable. But apparently Nigel Neal would not have his precious screenplay touched, completely fought against any changes, and ultimately took his name off the project. So John Carpenter has talked about how he loves Nigel Neal, who still loves Nigel Neal, but as a person, he hated him. Yeah. But I think that's kind of cool that, a few years after this difficult experience, and I think, these kind of things can really influence how you feel about someone. Totally. It can really affect how you feel about their work. Yeah. That John Carpenter was able to separate the two things and still make this film that was in absolute, reverence to this man whose work he's loved over the years. But apparently even, when he did this homage to Nigel Neal and did the Martin Quatermass thing for the screenplay, apparently Neal was very dismissive about that too, and was like, ridiculous that you would do this. So it's like, you just can't win with him, apparently.
Oh, it's so mean. Oh, poor John Carpenter. That's really interesting. And how do you think it holds up well as a science fiction story then, this film? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a lot of this kind of like pseudoscience going on. Does it matter? Do you need to understand that stuff about subatomic particles and relativity and all of that stuff?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't understand it. So, and I enjoy the film perfectly fine. I mean, John Carpenter's talked about when he was making this film that he was reading about quantum mechanics and reading about theoretical physics, and that very much like informed what he was doing and informed the story. He had this idea about, if matter has antimatter, then God must have an anti-God. So again, it was this idea of kind of combining the technological with the kind of theological, combining the kind of ancient with the modern, occult with science. These kind of things which are kind of apparently at odds with each other, and looking to fuse them together. I'm not sure how well that hangs together. I think there's loads of interesting ideas in there. I think that Donald Pleasance delivers all his lines with such gusto and such passion that it's hard not to get swept up in them. Sometimes when you actually stop and listen to what they're saying, it's like, huh? What? Yeah. And also they tend to repeat themselves a lot during this film as well. And it's like, just because you've told me that 5 times doesn't mean that it makes any sense.
No. Again, it's so similar to what we discussed with Fulci's trilogy as well. This kind of like, how much should you pay attention to this like plot mechanics, maybe best ignored. Carpenter does seem to have, even when you look at Halloween, this idea of the existence of evil as well, pure evil. I don't know whether Carpenter himself was in any way religious, but it does feel like a lot of that does play into his movies, this idea of whether you call it the devil or evil or whatever. It certainly exists in a lot of these movies, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. And I think, that there's lots of kind of themes within the Apocalypse trilogy as a whole, which tie in with Carpenter's other work. This idea of this pure evil, and particularly this kind of idea of a resurgence of an ancient evil, is very, very Carpenter. We see it in the Thing and Prince of Darkness and in The Mouth of Madness, but you also see it in something like The Fog as well. This idea of kind of ancient evil, ancient spirits coming back. There's also this element of being kind of under siege, being trapped in a space and being under siege. We have that in Assault on Precinct 13. Again, you have it in The Fog a little bit too. You have it very much in Prince of Darkness. So that's very much a Carpenterian kind of plot device.
Definitely.
And then also this idea of the kind of human image as this deceptive thing, this idea of the human image as something which can betray, which we see in all of the films in the Apocalypse trilogy, like I said, with The Thing, this idea of this kind of man being inhabited and being taken over by this other life form, but still looking like the man they originally were.
Yes.
And in Prince of Darkness, this idea of kind of being turned into this zombie, and in The Mouth of Madness being brainwashed. But we also see it in Village of the Damned with these aliens inhabiting this kind of childlike form. We see it in Ghosts of Mars, and we also see it in They Live as well. We don't see the true self. We don't see the true person behind the kind of flesh and skin that they inhabit.
Yeah, so true. I was thinking that myself. There is a real even The Fog. Those people, those ghosts that you see coming out of the fog, and there is this kind of real visual motif. It's the shape, I suppose, if you want to call it that. The shape from Halloween. This idea of just seeing these people, just these kind of cold, lifeless people that aren't really people, sort of standing watching somebody. That seems to be through so many of his films.
And we also have that in Prince of Darkness with the kind of homeless people that gather outside of the church.
Alex Cooper.
Exactly. Just these kind of watchers, these people that are there, these kind of lifeless, kind of dead behind the eyes groups that stand and kind of look on. I think, you see that in his representation of evil, and also the kind of people that are swept up in the evil too.
It's so interesting. There was that one moment with the homeless people, and again, I have no idea whether this was in any way an influence or Jordan Peele's Us, but a part of it really reminded me of Us. There's a moment when they look out the window and they see a line of people all stood there still, like kind of like the doubles in Us, and one of them is holding a pair of scissors, and then they obviously kill somebody with the scissors, and I was like, oh, it's very much. But again, you just think that, like you said, there's no way that all of these modern filmmakers aren't in some way influenced by Carpenter. I don't know whether that's a coincidence.
Yeah, no, that's true. I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, and the fact that they are these kind of like, kind of they're homeless people, they're kind of lower class citizens of society, kind of get coming back for revenge kind of thing. And so how do you think the kind of horror elements of it work? Because it does go into this kind of, they're these kind of slasher type killers, zombie type people, possessions, all of that kind of stuff. How does all of that kind of hang together as the film goes on, do you think?
Because there's loads of stuff going on in this film.
There's
kind of lots of shifts in terms of the way it's telling the story, and like you said, it's sometimes hard to grasp what exactly this film is.
Yes.
Is this slow burn supernatural movie? Is it science fiction? Is it an out and out kind of slasher shocker?
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that does make it hang together is the way that each of these things are presented, each of these different kind of cinematic styles and devices are presented is with this same style. It's like he doesn't switch things up as it goes throughout the film. It doesn't feel disjointed in that way. There's a rhythm to the film which never changes. So I think even when it makes these kind of leaps in terms of storytelling or the kind of narrative shifts that it takes, you just kind of go along with it. It's interesting that the old priest who dies at the beginning is part of this thing called the Brotherhood of Sleep, which is this kind of ancient, this long-standing tradition of kind of religious people who are keeping the secret of this kind of canister, keeping the secret about the actual truth about the evil that exists in this world. And and we have this kind of brotherhood of sleep presiding over things. But Prince of Darkness itself is quite a kind of soporific film.
Yeah.
In the way that it does lull you
Yes.
into this strange hypnotic state.
Definitely.
So it's almost like, you know, John Carpenter is the ultimate member of the Brotherhood of Sleep.
Yes.
Who's actually kind of, you know, making us kind of drowsy as we're
Luring
watching this
us
film.
into
Exactly.
this
There's something
world.
really, really interesting about it. And I think that I have a thing whenever I watch Prince of Darkness that sometimes my mind kind of wanders as I watch it.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a bad way, you know, I don't mean because I'm bored or I'm not interested, but it's there's something about the tone of it that it's hard to fully concentrate on that film sometimes, and sometimes think about other Carpenters. I'm thinking about how weird this film is, and then I'll go off on a little tangent, and then I'll kind of come back into it. I kind of love that about it.
Yeah, me too. And you know, you've touched upon this already about the characters, because there is a big group of characters here, and it kind of sets up at the beginning. We've kind of got these sort of central characters. There's that couple, the guy that sleeps with the woman at the beginning, these kind of students. Then you've obviously got Donald Pleasance and his friend, the kind of science and faith people. But then there's all these other characters as well. You know, you touched upon this already, but how much does Carpenter care about characters that we like and relate to?
It's kind of hard to know sometimes, like, if he does or doesn't care. It doesn't feel like in Prince of Darkness particularly, for me, is one of his least kind of emotionally engaging films. I think that for me is, I mean, you know, a kind of great example is I rewatched it the other night just to kind of get my mind back in the zone and thinking about it, and I honestly couldn't tell you any of the names of the characters in that film.
No idea.
Apart from, you know, Father Loomis.
Yes.
And the only reason I remember
Loomis.
that is because it's Loomis and it's the same name that Donald Pleasance has in Halloween. But, you know, these aren't necessarily characters that you remember or characters that stand out in the way that some of his past characters have. And I think, you know, he has had great characters in his movies, and
I think that's what makes
really
The Thing
memorable.
so brilliant.
Exactly. You know, you really care about those men. And I think that's the thing with the difference between The Thing and Prince of Darkness is the end of The Thing is really sad.
Yes.
It's sad in so many ways, but it's sad because, you know, the kind of breakdown, the destruction of what happens, and, you know, seeing these men, you know, destroyed, and seeing these men as these kind of shells of themselves, seeing these men killed, you know, all these different things. It's sad because you actually like them. Prince of Darkness doesn't have that sadness.
No, not at all.
Because you kind of don't really care as much.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we're going back to the Stone Tape. It's like that kind of. We talked about with the Stone Tape how it's just this like on this mass of people yelling at each other for an hour and a half, and it's kind of. I mean, there's no yelling in this. It's much quieter, but it's the same sort of thing where it's just this kind of mass of people. You don't really worry or care too much about who's who.
Yeah,
you know?
and people make strange decisions in Prince of Darkness. I always think about that bit where, you know, there's the guy and he's trapped in that kind of cupboard and they're on the other side of the wall and they're trying to knock through the wall.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, we can do this. And he's like, how long is it going to take? And they're like, oh, a couple of hours. And then they're just really gently chipping away at it. And then suddenly when he needs to get out, he seems to knock through it in about a minute. You know, there's kind of a lot of kind of inconsistencies in the way that people act, the way that people say. People don't seem that bothered by what's happening, by this kind of, you know, satanic goo that's spilling out. And, you know, there's something about the way that characters register emotion and the way that they interact with each other that doesn't quite ring true. Whereas in The Thing, it always does ring true. There's a kind of sense of humanity to that film.
Maybe there's just too many. You know, I could have done with them just cutting the amount of characters down by about half, maybe in this. You know, it might have helped.
Of course, that means that when you have fewer characters, you have fewer people to kill.
That's
so
true.
Actually,
that's very true.
You're kind of always torn within a horror movie, aren't you?
Absolutely.
It's like, I want millions of people that can be offed in various ways.
Exactly. And there's some good gore, there's some good nastiness in this as well, and there is some good, I think there's a good amount of tension and suspense too. The moment when the guy, you know, kind of lowers himself out of the window and drops out of the building and then gets attacked by the homeless people and all of that, and again, it's that kind of slow, deliberate pace that you get in things like Halloween and some of these other movies that it's really affecting still and quite creepy.
I really love that sequence in the with the guy. Actually, there's another character's name I remember. He's called Wyndham, and I only remember that because obviously that's a reference to John Wyndham, who wrote The Midwich Cuckoos, and, you know, which later Carpenter adapted as his version or his kind of remake of Village of the Damned. So again, you know, we see how John Carpenter loves to make references to his heroes, loves to make references to the people whose work he's admired and has and had a direct influence on the work that he in turn creates. But I love the scene with him where he's kind of outside and he's killed by the, you know, the kind of homeless person with that blade, and, you know, the way that shot is actually really interesting. It feels quite Argento in the way that he breaks down the sequence, the way that he does the close-ups, the knife kind of going along, and then the way that he cuts to the knife going in, and there's something that does feel kind of Argento-esque in that moment. And then also when we return to him later and we see him kind of stood in the distance with the bugs coming off him, and his head drops off, and but again, these are they're quite extreme moments, in terms of these kind of jolting shocks and these kind of gross out moments, these kind of bugs. But again, Carpenter does present them in a way that's quite kind of low energy.
Yeah, it's again quite similar to what we said about Fulci and how slow and long some of those scenes are with bugs and with gore and that kind of thing. It's just like, it is kind of low energy. There's nothing kind of like ba about it.
Yeah, it doesn't have like the pop of like something like some kind of Halloween, or some of his other kind of stuff. I think this is much more of a, again, it's he's part of the Brotherhood of Sleep, isn't he? So even in death, even in the kind of kills, there's a kind of soporific, low energy quality to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What do you make of the ending then? I mean, you said that these movies all have a quite nihilistic tone of, is humanity fucked by the end? Is that the case with this one? I mean, because they kind of, I think, beat it, don't they? I mean, she jumps into the mirror in order to kill the thing, and they smash the mirror and she gets trapped on the other side of it. What do you make of that whole ending?
The ending, the last 15 minutes for me is the great thing about Prince of Darkness. I think that image of her when she jumps through the mirror, and you see that shot of her on the other side, and this kind of expression on her face. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah, chilling.
It is chilling. Yeah. It really sticks with you, and it's. I think it's one of Carpenter's most beautiful images that he's ever created in his cinema. So I love that kind of whole end sequence. I think that he definitely does that thing where you think that the evil has been destroyed, and then you have that kind of little bit at the end where the guy wakes up and he goes to the mirror and you can see him about to kind of put his hand through, and then cut to credits. So I think the film's very clear that evil is not dead. That was just the beginning. This has been unleashed. They thought they could stop it. Of course they can't stop it. It's the devil. So I think there's this sense of like in The Thing when you end with these two men and it's like which one is the thing, and there's this kind of idea that this is just the beginning of something, and that now things will take their kind of logical conclusion and things will kind of move on and things will progress, and eventually all of humankind will be contaminated and infected and destroyed. I think that's the same with Prince of Darkness. There's no question for me that this isn't about the end of civilization.
How do you think it's handled? I mean, we've talked a lot about in occult movies about the depiction of the devil, I suppose, in films, and do you think it can ever work as a monster, as a viable monster, the devil? I mean, I suppose in a lot of the best ones it's that we don't see it, whatever this kind of evil thing is. Maybe it possesses people or it's kind of affecting things from afar, but we never actually see it, I suppose, which I guess is the case with Prince of Darkness, right? I
mean, it's this idea of the devil being, or it's slightly confusing, I think, in terms of the film, because they talk about the film as they talk about the evil as kind of Satan, as the devil, and as the kind of son of Satan, but also as this thing that almost goes beyond that, this kind of embodiment of pure evil that is this kind of green goo. And then you have this extension on the mythology of the film where you find out kind of essentially that Jesus was a kind of extraterrestrial being that came to Earth to warn people, and then there's been this kind of cover up by the church,
that's right,
who have kind of created this other mythology around God and the devil, but that doesn't incorporate this idea that actually pure evil does exist on Earth and is being contained within this church in the basement in LA. So there's lots of kind of stuff going on about religion, about the kind of role of the kind of roles of Jesus, the kind of the origin stories, I guess, of these characters, these people. So there's lots of kind of interesting stuff in there about the devil, about how we understand what he might mean. But I think what's kind of interesting is it does do this thing at the end of the film when she's reaching through the mirror. She's kind of got hold of the hand of Satan essentially and starts to kind of pull it out. And it is this kind of big red hoofy
That's
fist.
right. Yes.
So you get this really conventional idea of what we understand as, the devil's this kind of big red,
beast,
creepy, beastly thing. Exactly. And we see there's a bit in the film where one of the characters is watching a cartoon on TV, and you see this kind of vision, this kind of cartoonish image of the devil in the thing that he's watching. And again, it's this kind of red horned, hoofed character.
Yes.
And that's what we see being pulled through the mirror.
Yeah.
Part of me always wanted her to pull it a bit more and to see the rest of it. I think it's maybe probably best that we didn't. So, I do like the fact that the film has this really different version, this really different idea of what the physical manifestation of evil, the physical manifestation of the devil might be.
Yes.
And it is this kind of gooey liquid.
Yeah.
But also, it's the kind of Satan we all know and love.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Anything else you want to cover on Prince of Darkness before we move on?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, we've kind of briefly mentioned Alice Cooper.
Yeah.
It's quite fun seeing him in it. He's got really strange grey makeup throughout the film.
Yeah. He's good. He
doesn't have to say anything.
He's sufficiently
he stands
creepy.
There,
looking
weird.
He did a song for it.
I think, which I think you hear for about half a second in the film.
I mean, what do you think of the Carpenter music? I mean, it's pretty bog standard Carpenter music, right? How do you think it compares to some of his other themes and some of his other soundtracks?
Yeah, actually, I think the score for Prince of Darkness is interesting because it's not really one of my favourites, I have to admit.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of his more interesting. Yeah. In terms of how it, this kind of repetitive nature of it, how it does speak to kind of mood, and it doesn't function as, enhancing shocks or enhancing emotion. The music in the film is really persistent throughout. And again, sometimes you stop registering it because there's these themes that have been going for such a long time. Again, that kind of opening 15 minutes or so, this kind of repetitive nature of the music that suddenly just kind of is in your mind and you're kind of subconsciously aware of. Yeah. But you stop really listening to.
Totally, yeah.
So I think in that way it is really interesting, and it's super like anti-Hollywood, the way music works in a lot of his films, but particularly the way music works in this film. And I think that's again part of him moving away from this kind of studio produced work and moving into doing something that he completely wanted to do, that he doesn't have to kind of answer to anyone.
Yes, it's entirely his.
And again, so it's like he's kind of taken these things, these ideas, and the way he's used music, for example, before, and just gone all the way with it. Been like, I'm going to use music in the complete anti-Hollywood way that isn't going to spoon feed emotion. It isn't going to tell you what to think. It's almost weirdly impartial.
It is, yeah. It's cold again, isn't
cold.
it? Yeah, really. It's like a drone or something almost. Yeah, it's really.
But for me, it's not quite as as music as pieces of music in themselves. They don't register, or they don't kind of. I don't love them as much as some of his other. Probably better known scores.
Totally. So, overall then, I mean, I would still say, compared to some Carpenter movies, it's still one of the lesser known or lesser seen films. So, I mean, would you still recommend this to people that, haven't yet discovered this movie?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of consensus is changing over time. I think there's, I think it's a film that's been loved by kind of horror fans for a while, and I think people are starting to kind of get it a bit more, and people are starting to understand and be kind of open to it a little bit more. I would definitely not recommend you start with this film if you haven't seen other Carpenter work. I think this comes later.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you need to see kind of everything almost leading up to this. For this one to truly make sense. I think if this was the first John Carpenter film I ever saw, back then when I was a kid, who knows if how long it would have taken me to watch more of his films.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, I think it doesn't, sometimes it can do with a couple of watches as well to really appreciate it.
I think it does develop, and you appreciate it more over time. And again, it's just like I said, it's a film you have to get used to.
Yes.
And once you get used to it, if you can get on that register, I think there is so much in there that to love and to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello everybody, it's Mike here. I'm interrupting this broadcast to tell you a little bit about what we've got going on Patreon this week. Now, I often get asked by listeners over email or social media or in person what subgenre I'm going to be covering in the next series. People always want to know what are the next few seasons that I've got in mind. Now, I have actually figured out what I'm going to do for the next series, and I have announced it over on Patreon. And Patreon subscribers this week actually get the chance to help me program Series 6 of The Evolution of Horror, okay? So you get to suggest to me what films you would like to hear discussed on this particular series within this particular subgenre. It's a very, very exciting subgenre with so many interesting options in terms of films to be covered. I'm having such fun hearing suggestions from you guys, and I will soon be following up all of your suggestions and getting back to you and programming this new series. So if you want to be involved in this discussion, if you want to be part of this exclusive club in which you get these exclusive new bonus episodes, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon page. It's only $5 per month. That's about £3.80. That's very, very little to spend per month in order to get weekly bonus episodes and actually help me shape the future of this podcast and the next series. So if you want to get involved, head over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. And if you are kind enough and generous enough to donate $5 per month, you will get all of this bonus content. You'll also get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if you're UK based, and everybody also gets a special shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who's joined up to our Patreon channel in the last couple of weeks a very special thank you. So a big thanks to Patrick Gallagher, Paul Ross, Graham Hughes, Brendan Maguire, Douglas Harner, Simon Woolley, Ewan Stewart, Simon Meek, Thorsten Amula, Vincent Gain, Jameis Wilkes, Lewis Smith, Amber Rose Kandahaz, Claire Finney, Lauren Hart, Torsten Odenthal, Jana Wright, Jay Espindola, Vessel Costa, Vicky Pierre Humbert, Eddie Langham, Harry Allard, and Kyle Lewis. A huge thank you to all of those people for getting involved and also getting involved in the conversation, helping me program Series 6 of the podcast. I think it's going to be a really, really exciting next series. And one more time, if you want to find out before everyone else what that is and help me program it, then get involved. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to our discussion of John Carpenter as we move on to our second review of the week, In the Mouth of Madness from 1994.
This one will drive you absolutely mad.
The riots began because the stores could not meet the demands of Sutter Kane's novel, In the Mouth of Madness.
Kane disappeared 2 months ago without a trace. He's the guy that writes horror books.
You can forget about Stephen King. Kane outsells them all. I need to know if he's alive or dead, and I need that book.
It's a setup. I just have to work out how it's set up.
Kane's writing has been known to have an effect on his readers.
See this? It's a map. This whole thing has been staged.
You just get out.
This is not reality.
It's all happening for real, Trent.
In the Mouth of Madness, my favourite. I love it so much. So In the Mouth of Madness is about an insurance investigator, Trent, who is hired by a publishing agency to investigate their author Sutter Kane, who's gone mysteriously missing. So they're waiting for him to deliver his new book, In the Mouth of Madness, but no one can find him. So Trent is paired up with someone from the publishers, someone called Styles, and the pair of them venture out to find Sutter Kane. Along the way, Trent discovers a kind of a place called Hobbs End, which doesn't really appear on the maps, which is a place which features in Sutter Kane's work, and they travel to Hobbs End where they find Kane and find I guess the truth of what's really happening with his work, which is supposedly supposed to infect and brainwash and destroy its readers. I guess that was a kind of awkward retelling of the story, but that's kind of what it's about.
Well, I think the thing is, it's one of those stories where like you get to about halfway and then it just starts to completely unravel, and I don't really know what I'm watching in the latter half of this film, but I guess that's the point as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a film about kind of versions of reality. So you start in one reality, you move into another reality, you move into another reality, and at the end you question if the reality you started with was actually reality. I think there's lots of kind of levels of
absolutely
of I say reality, but maybe it should be unreality in the film. And I think it's about this idea of fiction, and what if what we believe is fiction is in fact real.
Yes, I love that about it. So you are clearly a fan of this movie. Is it your favourite Carpenter, did you say?
It is my favourite Carpenter. I don't think it's necessarily because I think it's his best film. It's so hard when people's like, what do you think is his best film? Because, I think it's super obvious to say, but I think Halloween is like a perfect film.
Yeah.
I think it's, so maybe if I was being objective, I might not pick In the Mouth of Madness, but In the Mouth of Madness for me is the one that I've thought about the most over the years, the one that I've kind of returned to the most. And also I think part of that is because it's quite unloved.
Yeah, of course.
Feel like you want to champion, I feel like protective of In the Mouth of Madness.
I actually am very surprised at how unloved this film is, because it's so good, it's so interesting. You've got Sam Neill at the centre of it. Like, I'm surprised people don't talk about this film more. Why don't they talk about it? Is it just that John Carpenter had kind of lost his, I don't know, like we said, it was kind of gone into that slightly latter part of his career by this point. People just weren't paying as much attention to Carpenter.
Yeah, I think there's a few factors in why In the Mouth of Madness didn't get the attention it deserved when it first came out, and why it hasn't kind of registered in the same way that some of his other films.
Yeah.
I think that the 90s was, especially the kind of early 90s, was quite a difficult time for horror cinema. I think it was a real lull. I think it's one of the biggest lulls that we've ever had.
Absolutely.
Not to say there's not lots of films in the early 90s that I know and love.
Yeah.
But, I think
generally
in terms
speaking,
of kind of critical and commercial success, there was a real kind of dearth of work coming out of that time. I think this is partly because the 80s was so huge. 80s was such a boom in terms of slashers and sequels and franchises. it was a big business for horror in the 1980s, and then moving into the 1990s, the kind of big franchises, the Friday the 13th and the
we were at the kind of arse end of those franchises by the early 90s, where we part 10 and 11
churning out a few more. They were getting increasingly less successful by this point, both in terms of box office and in terms of artistic success.
Yes, absolutely.
And so there was a kind of maybe a feeling that horror was running out of steam, running out of ideas. Yeah. Meanwhile, some of the kind of big horror names, Tobe Hooper, who had made obviously such a big splash in the 70s and kind of started to decline in terms of quality of work in the 80s. By the early 90s, you could kind of write him off to a certain extent. George Romero, again, his trajectory was interesting because by the late 80s, when he was working on a slightly bigger kind of studio production, his losing a bit of kind of creative control and kind of struggling with the work that he was making. So there wasn't, the kind of there was a kind of decline in the amount of work that he was producing, but also kind of perhaps arguably the quality of the work because of external forces, although I still think the stuff that he was making was super interesting. Someone like William Friedkin, who'd made the Exorcist, which everyone loves, made The Guardian in the early 90s, which was fairly disastrous for him as a return to horror. I love it.
Of course.
Someone like David Cronenberg had pretty much left horror behind to a certain extent by the 90s, moving into thinking about something like Dead Ringers or Crash in kind of mid-90s. So I think there was exactly a movement away from this kind of horror roots. And then, also in the 90s, we saw a move away from what we typically understand as horror cinema through to more of a kind of psychological thriller. Yes. It was early 90s, was very much yuppies in peril.
Totally.
And it was a different kind of horror film that people could say was a thriller, not a horror movie. So again, it was kind of classier, it was more sophisticated.
Yeah, well, what's so interesting, isn't it, is that we all talk about the early 90s as being a bit of a lull for horror, and yet it's one of the only times in history that we've had a horror Best Picture winner with The Silence of the Lambs, right? So it's a real kind of dichotomy there.
Exactly. And I think, horror in this time, while your kind of trashier end of horror was completely dismissed and completely kind of forgotten, your kind of high-end horror or your thrillers were kind of doing better business, and they were kind of awards friendly. You have Silence of the Lambs, like you mentioned, something like Misery.
Yes.
A film like Wolf, which is attracting kind of big name stars and, kind of A-list celebs. And then also around the same time, you had the kind of resurgence of literary adaptations. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, things like Interview with the Vampire. So there was a kind of this idea that horror could be classy. And we don't want the other kind. We don't want the 80s horror. That was kind of gross and trashy. We want classy, big budget, big star, A-list horror. So I think, there's all these kind of factors which meant that, that period of time was a kind of hard time to be producing a kind of lower budget, kind of horror film.
Yeah.
And so, a few years later, we have Scream, we have the Blair Witch Project, and they're
kind of comes back then, doesn't it?
Yeah, both of them kind of bring something, not necessarily something new, because I think we'd seen the things that they were doing before in other films, but they did it in a way that just hit at the right point.
Yes.
This kind of zeitgeist, and it, both of them kind of propelled new trends and new kind of crazes for horror cinema in terms of postmodernism, in terms of found footage, and both of them meant that horror cinema could once again be commercially viable, and critically acclaimed at the same time. So, In the Mouth of Madness kind of fell in this no man's land,
right? Yeah,
in between. So I think it's really sad that it kind of came at a point when no one cared.
Yes,
and also, you mentioned about Carpenter himself. I mean, the film that he'd made before it was Memoirs of an Invisible Man, and he'd also made Body Bags, which I mentioned before, which kind of came and went without any real interest. I think Body Bags was actually a kind of TV produced film.
Right.
So there wasn't this sense of anticipation for a new John Carpenter film.
Yeah.
And this one came and no one really paid that much attention to it. So it's kind of sad about when it hit, but also in some ways it was kind of perfect timing.
Yes.
And looking back at it, it's like there couldn't have been a better moment for this film, because In the Mouth of Madness is about what happens if we don't take horror seriously.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion in the film about that, Sutter Kane is this hack, it's like horror is trash. Why do people read this stuff? But, that there's this kind of fan appetite for it. And, it's almost like horror has the last laugh. It's like horror is the thing that we need to think about. We need to be aware of. We need to talk about. Yeah. And if we don't, look at the hell that will ensue.
Oh, that's so interesting. I want to touch upon that in a minute, but first of all, I want to ask you, Sutter, how much is this movie about somebody like Stephen King? I mean, is it? Do you think he's directly talking about a writer like Stephen King with Sutter Kane?
Yeah, I think he's talking about two writers. He's talking about Sutter Kane, and he's talking about Stephen King, and he's talking about H.P. Lovecraft.
Of course, yeah.
And both of which we'll talk about. But with King, King's almost used as a kind of barometer for success. So, they mention in the film that, you can forget about Stephen King, and Sutter Kane outsells him, like 20-1.
Yes, that's right. Stephen King does still exist in this world, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like this idea that we have what everyone understands as the most successful, kind of profitable horror writer, and we're like, forget about him. Yeah. Kane is king, essentially. Yes. Both kind of literally in name, but also like metaphorically being this kind of king of horror. So it ties into this idea of horror as a commodity, horror as this kind of sellable thing. We're told these things as his publishers proudly announce, how successful he is and how desperate they are for his new manuscript, because they want to sell copies. And they've already sold the rights to his film, and all this kind of stuff. So Kane is very much kind of influenced by King in that sense. I think there are kind of parallels as well in terms of the work, but I think you see that through the lens of Lovecraft. So you see, King has talked about how he's influenced by H.P. Lovecraft. Yes. And, he's written several stories which are directly kind of Lovecraftian. Something like Weeds, which was the story that ended up being the lonesome death of Geordie Verrill in Creepshow, is very much a kind of riff on Colour Out of Space, for example.
Of course.
And something like Revival, which is one of his more recent books. So for me, it's his best book one of his best books ever. Really? Actually, I love Revival, but he talked about that as his attempt to write a Lovecraft story without this kind of knotty, thorny, pretentious language that sometimes Lovecraft could use. So I think again there are kind of parallels with King and some of his preoccupations with some of the themes that you see in The Mouth of Madness. King often writes about writers, writes about the process of writing, and of course In The Mouth of Madness is very much about an author's work and how their work influences and affects the people who read it. So we see this throughout kind of King stories, both in terms of quite literally just books about writers, Misery or something like that. But in The Dark Half, this idea of this kind of pseudonym coming to life. So this idea of fiction merging with fact about the creations that he puts onto the page manifesting into physical forms. one of his stories in Skeleton Crew, Word Processor for the Gods, is about someone with this kind of magic typewriter who what he writes changes the course of what's actually happening in the world, which is completely like Sutter Kane. This is what it is. So there are definitely kind of parallels with the two work, but I think Lovecraft is such a kind of key point in between those three things. So I think, like Lovecraft, Kane and King are
one.
They work
like
together
an unholy
as
trinity.
One. Exactly.
Yeah, you're so right. And the film absolutely feels more Lovecraft than anything else, I suppose, as it goes on. In the way that we talked about Prince of Darkness being very much Nigel Kneale, this is very much Lovecraft, isn't it? What, just briefly again, we've touched upon this already, I think, with Gates of Hell, actually, but just briefly, tell us what you mean by Lovecraftian, I suppose. What is a kind of typical Lovecraftian story?
So I think a typical Lovecraftian story is, in its essence, kind of nihilistic, misanthropic stories about the kind of insignificance of humanity.
Yes,
essentially.
Yes.
This is kind of tied up quite often in kind of sci-fi monster stories. With kind of tentacled beasts and creatures from outer space. But essentially at the kind of core of Lovecraft's work was this idea of cosmicism, this theory that he had, and this idea that humanity is just a tiny blip in our cosmos. That there are kind of otherworldly, much more powerful beings out there who are kind of controlling what's going on. And we're like insects, or we're like bacteria that just inhabit this earth. And we can be destroyed at any time. So again, I talked earlier about Carpenter and this idea of individuality and free will and these kind of existential concerns of people. And Lovecraft's work is essentially from the outset saying that man is insignificant. There is no such thing as kind of individuality. There is no such thing as free will because we're being controlled by something else, and essentially our own need to think that we have some kind of agency in this world is pathetic. Really. So it's kind of tough to make these stories for the screen, to kind of adapt his work, because I think that there's something, the kind of nihilistic, fatalistic tendencies of his work are so depressing and so present that they're kind of hard to tell on screen. They're kind of hard to turn into kind of marketable cinema.
They're often called unfilmable, aren't they? A lot of his stories and a lot of these themes. I know a lot of people have said that about Richard Stanley's Colour Out of Space, famously, right? That it was this kind of unfilmable book, and it seems to be that label is attached a lot to Lovecraft.
Absolutely. And we've seen Lovecraft adaptations throughout cinema, and I think they're kind of largely unsuccessful. I think there's ones in there that we know and love. Reanimator is a hoot. We all love Incredible. Reanimator, but Reanimator is a kind of riff on Lovecraft. It's not really a straightforward Lovecraft adaptation. It takes his kind of nihilistic, pessimistic, fatalistic tendencies and turns it into a kind of knockabout splatter film.
It actually feels much less Lovecraftian than certain things that Lovecraft didn't considering it's an adaptation of a Lovecraft.
Exactly. So it's kind of like Stuart Gordon, who made Reanimator, who's a huge Lovecraft fan, has returned to Lovecraft consistently throughout his career and made several adaptations.
From Beyond.
So good.
I love that so much. But
it's almost like he's submitting himself to this idea that, you can't adapt Lovecraft, you just can't do it. So I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm not gonna try, because even if I tried, I'd probably fail. And I think you see that kind of later on when he does Reanimator, he does From Beyond, and then he progressively becomes more serious with Castle Freak, and then with Dagon, which I enjoy, but again, they're just not completely successful in what they're doing. So it's like almost like the more literal you are in translating him for the screen, the kind of worse off you come.
I agree. It's something it's conceptual, isn't it? And that's what's really difficult to get across on screen. This idea of like it's something that's beyond our own comprehension or understanding, and therefore how do you visualize that?
Exactly. So it's almost like the more kind of successful things are, like I said, they're kind of riffs on Lovecraft, rather than specifically Lovecraft. I mean, we see an influence of Lovecraft in so many other films that we don't think of as Lovecraft movies. The creature design of Alien has a kind of Lovecraftian quality. something like Evil Dead, the mention of the Necronomicon. I think in Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy, we get a sense of this kind of ancient tome, this kind of this Necronomicon of sorts. So the kind of spirit and ideas of Lovecraft exist in other facets of horror cinema. But it's those kind of more literal, straightforward adaptations that don't often seem to quite work, until I think Colour Out of Space, Richard Stanley's film, which I think is really great and really successful. But I think that one of the other problems isn't just this kind of far-reaching nihilistic philosophical concepts of Lovecraft, but also, Lovecraft was definitely not interested in character. He was definitely not interested in people. He was a misanthrope. He was a recluse. He was a misogynist. He was a racist. He was not a good guy. And he writes characters that are there just to serve a purpose. The only emotional register that he really understands in terms of his kind of characters is fear. Is fear and kind of there's this idea of someone being kind of interested or inquiring minds, and then those kind of academic scientific minds being destroyed. But he he's not interested in like friendship or love or relationships or like emotion. So it's kind of hard to adapt these stories and be really faithful, because you'd have these kind of vapid on-screen characters that don't exist, that don't really say anything. His dialogue was awkward and stilted. Stephen King talked about that and said, Lovecraft's like one hell of a writer, but his dialogue is terrible. And I think you get this sense of, this is dialogue written by someone who doesn't have conversations with people.
There you go.
It's like he doesn't chat with people, he doesn't have friends, so he can't write this dialogue. So so there's a lot of work you have to do to fill in the gaps. If you're adapting Lovecraft for the screen, and where In the Mouth of Madness is so successful is it's not an adaptation of a Lovecraft story. It's kind of, for me, it's the best Lovecraft movie there's ever been. But there's no Lovecraft in the Mouth of Madness. It's like a composite of various different things that he's written.
Exactly, and you're right, and it's marrying that kind of coldness, I suppose, of Lovecraft with the King, which is the polar opposite, right? Stephen King is like bordering on unbearably sentimental at times. It's the opposite kind of dynamic in some ways, and how human his stories are, and it kind of, again, it's bringing all those elements together, isn't it? Which is really nice.
So the film ultimately becomes this kind of this homage, this love letter, this kind of mood board of various Lovecraftian ideas that have existed. And, he does it in a way that creates these characters that we can identify with. It's like Trent, the Sam Neill character, becomes this kind of wisecracking, sardonic kind of guy who's like our guide through Lovecraft. He's like someone we can relate to. So it's like, okay, come with me. I'll take you on this kind of journey, and I'll kind of scoff at it along the way, and then I'll eventually understand what's going on and the true horror of the vastness of the nightmare that's kind of going on. So without him, it would be much harder for people to kind of get through that film without that emotional core that character provides. And you just don't see that in his stories.
No, you're so right. Let me briefly ask you about Sam Neill then as well, because this must have been more after he had done Jurassic Park, for example. I mean, this is quite a big... but Sam Neill's done some really interesting stuff, hasn't he? When you look at, from like Possession to The Omen 3 and some of these really interesting genre films as well. He does an amazing job in this movie, right? As well as our kind of, I suppose, conduit through this world.
Yeah, he's super fun in it. And, you mentioned Possession, which is totally Lovecraftian in so many ways, in terms of these kind of tentacles. Monstrous thing. So I think Sam Neill's not afraid to make kind of strange, out there horror choices in the work that he does. He's a lot of fun in this film. I think Carpenter had worked with him previously on Invisible Man. So they had a kind of relationship, and I guess they had a good working relationship. And he's a lot of fun. You get a sense of an actor having fun.
Absolutely, you feel like he gets it, right? I think, let me ask you briefly then, in a kind of occult context, I suppose, what this movie's kind of doing with, and you've talked about this in your book, that there is a lot of kind of religious iconography in this story, and is he dabbling with any of the same themes, I suppose, as he has done in Prince of Darkness, about the idea of evil, or is it something more conceptual than that? This idea that like the writer is a god or a devil in some way, or what's going on there, do you think?
I think there's like a really interesting progression in terms of how evil manifests in the trilogy. So in the first film, you have this alien entity, and very much the film is kind of rooted in this foundation of science,
yes,
and of research, and then moving into Prince of Darkness, and you have this, this goo in this container, and the kind of framework is much more about religion, much more about theology, and much more about ideas. And then you move into In the Mouth of Madness, and the evil is kind of trapped within words, within words on the pages of this book, and becomes very much about art, about the kind of creation of art and how that influences people. So you go from science through to religion to art as these three kind of conduits for evil.
Yes.
And it's interesting that, in both The Thing and Prince of Darkness, it's a kind of material object. The evil is like a physical thing that we can see, that we can touch, that, that kind of exists. Whereas in The Mouth of Madness, evil is much more kind of obscure in terms of this intangible idea of stories, of prose, of language, of ideas being the kind of catalyst for this evil. So I think it's it's much more, it takes these kind of existential implications that we've seen in the first two films and goes even further with them. We're fully into the idea of what is reality. Quite literally, like, what is real? Like, is this piece of fiction that I'm reading actually a guide to what's going on around me? So there's that kind of increasing idea, and I think through that you do get this sense of the writer or the kind of novelist, the author, being this kind of godlike figure who's dictating what happens around us. So we see that, we think of Stephen King's word processor of the gods. This idea of the kind of gods controlling and being not just a kind of cultural commentator, but like a modern day prophet. Yeah, definitely. And this idea that from the beginning, these people, these fans, are like these kind of like acolytes or something, these crazed people running around with axes and everything, and this idea of fandom and toxic fandom in some ways as well. It's got a lot going on there. You can't help but think of like people queuing up outside bookstores for the new Harry Potter or Twilight book, or this kind of like crazy consumerist behaviour that we see, that Carpenter is constantly critiquing in his films, and is very much kind of critiquing in this one, definitely. And then meanwhile this idea of I think the kind of fundamental idea of Christianity serves as a framework for so much of horror cinema that we see. Horror films are quite often a story of good versus evil, and more often than not good is represented by this kind of devil, satanic presence. And on the opposite, you've got kind of religion and God as this kind of good. So in the Mouth of Madness, Cain is your antagonist. Cain is this kind of devil to a certain extent. But it's interesting. He describes his work as the new Bible. So he's positioning himself as this storyteller, but this kind of religioso. This kind of almost this like figure of good, this thing that's serving this divine purpose. So we kind of, what we end up having is almost like this kind of gospel according to Cain. So I think within In the Mouth of Madness, we see Christian and kind of Catholic iconography used throughout the film. The black church, this kind of inverted cross crucifix that we see throughout the film. There are other references, the idea of Cain being a reference to Cain and Abel, Cain being this kind of first perpetrator of murder. Hobbs End, Hob was like a medieval term for the devil. So there's lots of stuff in there that's kind of fused with Christian iconography and Christian understandings. But I think the other kind of religion that serves as like a really interesting framework for the film is Scientology. When Michael DeLuca, who wrote the screenplay for In the Mouth of Madness, was talking about the film, he listed like 3 people as influences on his screenplay. He talked about H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, and L. Ron Hubbard. So it's interesting that not only is he taking this kind of, the kind of creator of Scientology as an influence, but he's grouping him with these 2 writers of kind of horror and science fiction. So he's kind of saying that like he's an equivalent of one of them. And L. Ron Hubbard did begin as a writer, did write these kind of science fiction tales. He was often published in the same publications that Lovecraft stories were published in. So the 2 of them, there's lots of kind of parallels in what they're doing, and there's a kind of fundamental basis of Scientology which is built around this idea of immortal beings and past lives that we've had, not just on this earth, but beyond.
Yeah.
And there's something quite Lovecraftian about these kind of concepts.
Yeah.
So we have this idea of a kind of conflict between kind of creator of fiction and religious leader.
Mm-hmm.
And, like fandom and followers. And so there's all this stuff that's kind of linked in with Kane and what it means and what he does. So, is L. Ron Hubbard a sci-fi writer, or is he this like messianic force in our world? And so, you see there's obviously very literal parallels there, and particularly in terms of when we think about Scientology, and there's a lot of criticism around Scientology and a lot of skepticism around it, and brainwashing is often a word that's used when people talk about it. And I think that's very much kind of present in The Mouth of Madness, this idea of being brainwashed, this idea of, again, we talked about kind of hypnosis as part of Prince of Darkness. It's this idea of you're kind of lulled into feeling a certain way, the way that the director of the film or the writer of the book wants you to feel. So, if we look back at some of L. Ron Hubbard's work, his fiction work that he wrote before Dianetics, which is the kind of foundation of Scientology, and there was one called Typewriter in the Sky, in which a man is like transported into the narrative of the book. And Typewriter in the Sky really sounds like Word Processor of the Gods, which is the Stephen King. So you see how actually King could be influenced by Lovecraft, but there's actually a kind of Hubbard connection there, which is super interesting. And Hubbard also wrote a book called Excalibur, which he actually said was like too much for people to read. You'd go mad if you read it, because it was so potent and terrifying and so kind of extreme in what he was doing. So there's these kind of links between his fiction through to his religion, through to his believers, that's very much kind of parallel to Sutter Kane and the things that he does. And Scientology at its very core is about this idea of a kind of search for a true personal identity.
Right, yeah.
So it's this idea of the kind of the person, there's something kind of existential about what it's saying, what it's doing. So again, it ties into these kind of concepts we see throughout the Apocalypse trilogy, about free will, about individuality, which Carpenter kind of delights in destroying. But this idea of kind of fact and fiction, I think, is something that's really, really present in The Mouth of Madness, and Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard makes a really fascinating kind of counterpoint to that, and kind of what it means to believe in something, like what it truly means to believe in something.
It's so interesting, and that parallel between like fictional writer and God, or Messiah, or cult leader. It's really interesting.
But then I think it's really interesting that that Carpenter is kind of controlling all of this as director. So you've got these ideas of kind of like power, and who is the kind of author of this text, and who is the kind of defining voice in this film.
I love that about it. And there is I think from the get-go, from the opening credits where you see In the Mouth of Madness the book being printed, right, it's like it sets up this kind of layers and layers of these kind of meta levels, I suppose, and layers. And let me ask you, about that, about the fact that this is very much about the horror genre and about the text that we're seeing. It feels like this is at the cusp of a wave of stories that we were about to get, like that kind of meta postmodern narratives in horror. And you've talked about this in your book, about how obviously I think a movie that straight away it reminded me of was Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which came out a year later, where you've literally got Wes Craven as a character in his own film writing a script, and we're seeing the script as they're writing it and reading it. It's really interesting, those comparisons. I mean, again, why was all of that happening around this time, do you think? Was that just something that was just a coincidence? I don't know.
Maybe there was something about that time where there was this kind of lull. And maybe there was filmmakers were thinking more about horror. Thinking more about
reflecting back on what we've just seen almost.
I think, Wes Craven's New Nightmare was very much a kind of, born out of a need for Craven to reclaim this thing that he'd created, that had become something maybe that he didn't want it to be, that he didn't intend it to be. Around the time that In the Mouth of Madness came out, John Carpenter did an interview with Fangoria, and he was talking about this isn't a great time for horror, just before late, I think it's in like 1993, and he was saying,
so he even knew that at the time.
He was kind of, and he said something about like we need the kind of equivalent of what like 2001 did for science fiction.
Right.
We need a film to come along to rewrite the language. We need a film to come along to shake things up and to make people be like, whoa, that is what horror can do. So I think there was this need, this kind of desire, this kind of understanding that something kind of had to happen.
Yes.
And, you know, you're absolutely right. I think that Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a really interesting companion piece.
Yeah, they're so
to In the Mouth of Madness.
Yeah.
I mean, both are about this idea of a fictional evil crossing over into the real world. Both are about horror as a kind of cultural force.
Yes.
But I think also they're about this kind of idea of the author as creator of worlds, and this idea of the power of idea being so strong that it can actually bring forth a physical manifestation of what's happening. So, you know, there's something about In the Mouth of Madness where you could, in another world, it could be called John Carpenter's New Nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea that I suppose both of them comment on the horror genre in that, you know, it could initially be perceived with both of them that it's like horror causes evil people to do evil things or influence in some way, but it's also about kind of keeping horror or real evils at bay in some way as well, isn't it? And kind of containing it or something.
Yeah, I think John Carpenter's really having fun with In the Mouth of Madness because, you know, I mean, we know that, you know, a kind of conservative point of view of horror cinema is that it's bad, that it's damaging, that it creates killers, that it's, you know, a destructive force within our world. And I think horror filmmakers can come under a lot of scrutiny and can come under a lot of criticism from people who think that the work that they produce has negative impacts on society. Yeah. So Carpenter's kind of having a laugh with that. Yeah. You know, he's like, okay, do you know what? If you're going to say that horror is bad, I'm going to show you how bad horror can be. You know, this book, and then ultimately the kind of film of the film that's made in the film, can be so bad, it will literally turn people into homicidal maniacs and it will destroy the world. Yeah. You know, you want horror to be a negative force, like... Here you go, absolutely. And it really does feel, compared to all the other Carpenter films we've talked about, it feels playful, it feels fun. Like it's meant, the characters are more fun. There are definite there are jokes, you know, even the end when Sam Neill is sat in the cinema eating popcorn and watching what is just, it feels like a kind of punchline or something. Maybe it's the way that Sam Neill portrays it with his performance as well. Everything's quite heightened. But compared to, for example, you know, what you were talking about with the tone and pace of Prince of Darkness, and even The Thing, this kind of quite kind of like sorrowful almost kind of tone. This feels like it's having much more fun. Yeah, his punch here, it's faster paced. Than Prince of Darkness. You know, it has a more, although the narrative is complicated, it's much kind of easier to follow, much more kind of a fun ride as you're going along. And you see that, like you're saying, you mentioned the kind of opening credits and the pages of Kane's book kind of churning out on this printing press, and in the background you've got this kind of like heavy metal guitar riffs. You know, it's like that's a very different opening credit sequence to Prince of Darkness. Totally. So it's like instantly, you know, he's saying like, this is a different movie, different territory. Definitely. You know, and the film may have later then been kind of proclaimed by Carpenter as the third part in this trilogy. But you see how the films kind of stylistically and the way that they actually affect you and the way that you experience them with viewers are very, very different. Yes. Although the kind of ideas are there and the ideas and concepts are the same. Yeah, definitely. And you know, you talked about how it's almost this like kind of hypnotic experience watching Prince of Darkness, and it's a little bit like that watching this in a different kind of way, but it's disorientating and it's out there and it's weird, and it is a trip in some ways watching it and going along with it, and kind of at some point I just had to stop trying to get my head around exactly what's happening and just kind of let it overcome me in some way. Yeah, you know, there's like layers in that film. You know, we've got a book within a book within a film within a film. Yeah, exactly. You know, there's a kind of moment in it. There's like a bit where Sam Neill falls asleep and wakes up, and the deformed cop is next to him, and then he re-wakes up. So you've got dreams within dreams. Yeah, and actually that dream within a dream is basically copied from the dream within a dream that happens in the Prince of Darkness. Yes, of course. Yeah. So you see him replicating his own work. Yeah. But it's very much, it's a kind of like a Russian doll. You know, there's like layers within layers, within layers within layers. It's like the Inception of horror films. 100%. Yeah, it is exactly like that. But it's so it's hard to know what reality you're supposed to exist in. And I think, you know, this is exacerbated by the fact that the film begins with Sam Neill's character being, you know, thrown into a kind of mental asylum and, you know, locked up in this padded cell with a straitjacket on. So we begin with this idea that the story that we're being told is from a crazy person.
Yes.
And, that's very much a, this kind of structure of the story is very much like the Lovecraft story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which begins with a person in an asylum telling this story. So you've got this unreliable narrator, so you don't know if what they're telling you is true or just like the ravings of a lunatic.
That's it. Everything about the film feels kind of unstable and unreliable, doesn't it? Which makes it a really fun ride.
Yeah, so it's like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's like, who is telling us this story and how can we believe them? So, In the Mouth of Madness, through every aspect of what it is about storytelling.
Yes.
It's about the truths, the fictions, whatever we're being told, and how we choose to understand them.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I feel like we could go on for hours about this, but I'm going to start to wrap it up. But I want to ask you, just in a very kind of basic horror context, I suppose, how do you think the horror works in comparison to Prince of Darkness and The Thing? Like the monsters, the scares, etc. How do you think it works and hangs together as a horror film?
Oh, it's the best, the funnest and rompiest of all. I love it so much. I really do. I mean, I remember when it came out, or just before it came out, and I used to read Fangoria and kind of various horror magazines, and they kind of covered it a lot in the run-up, and I was super excited. Couldn't wait for it to come out. And I remember it kind of came out, and I was too young to see it at the cinema, but it came out and it got really bad reviews. It got a fairly not a great review in Fangoria. I remember it getting like 2 stars in Empire, which I used to read religiously, and kind of seeing this stuff and thinking to myself, oh, that's sad that it's not going to be very good. And then I watched it, and I remember really strongly feeling this sense of like injustice, and thinking that was fucking amazing. Like, what are people talking about? And I think that sense of something's wrong here has something that stayed with me. It's something about why probably now I think about In the Mouth of Madness as my favourite Carpenter, and probably why I ended up writing a book on it.
It's amazing,
because I felt like there was a wrong that needed to be kind of righted here. So
totally. And I think there is, as with so many of these types of films, it has started to develop this kind of cult reputation now, and you see its influence again on look at Benson and Moorhead and their films like The Endless and Resolution. I think there's something very much that feels like, obviously it's very Lovecraftian, but there's something that feels quite In the Mouth of Madnessy about that. These images of people stuck in a loop, and these like kind of little pockets of kind of communes and towns and that kind of
absolutely.
thing.
And again, there's this kind of interest about a conflict between kind of science and supernatural, which is very kind of present in there, which is very kind of Carpenter, and definitely Nigel Neal was very Prince of Darkness.
Absolutely. And even in Resolution, this idea of characters and their creator and the storyteller and the filmmaker, and this kind of God watching over them sort of thing. So there's a lot of that, and I feel like it is slowly seeping back into people's hearts in a way in The Mouth of Madness. Amazing. Michael, thank you. Where can, if people do want to come and find out more about In the Mouth of Madness and read your book, where can they find your book?
They can find it in all good bookstores. Actually, that's probably not true. You can probably find it in some very niche bookstores. I'd say just pop online. You can order a copy.
Exactly. Amazon. That's where I got mine. Amazing. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. This has been pleasure. Fascinating. Where can I just ask you as well, while we're in this occult subgenre, apart from In the Mouth of Madness, what's your favourite occult movie? Favourite satanic horror movie?
It's tough. There's so many good ones. There's all the greats,
the classics.
Rosemary's Baby, Suspiria. How can you not love them? I love The Craft. Oh, of course. I love The Craft. But actually one that a more recent one that I really love, which has, is not had a lot of kind of attention. Not a lot of people have seen it, but I think those people that have seen it really, really love it and feel passionately about it, is Liam Gavin's A Dark Song. Oh. What an incredible film. Really interesting in terms of this idea of kind of occult practice. And I think for me, the last 10 minutes or so of that film is just like transcendental. It goes somewhere so interesting.
Really scary film as well. I saw it thanks to you because of the LFF cult strand, and it is absolutely one of my favorite horror films of the last 10 years. It's wonderful.
Really, really love it. And I think not enough people, it just didn't get the attention I wish it had have gotten. So yes, definitely people should seek out A Dark Song. It's one of the kind of great modern day occult films.
Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you so much. And Michael, if people want to come and check out what's next on TerrorVision and all of that kind of thing, what's next? What have you got coming up?
So in January, on Thursday the 30th, we are screening The Children, an early 80s horror movie about kids with killer nuclear hugs. It was like produced around the same, like basically the same kind of crew as Friday the 13th. It was filmed back to back.
Nice.
So it kind of feels like it's got that same kind of vibe to it. It's got that
cool.
same. There's something in the kind of quality of the film and the music that feels the same, but it's the story is very different. It's great.
Amazing.
If you haven't seen it, it's super nasty, super weird.
Okay.
Lots of fun. And then next month in February, on as always the final Thursday of the month, is Tourist Trap. Your reaction clearly shows that you've seen it. Another kind of great weirdy, slightly slasher-esque,
yes,
but supernaturally riff on House of Wax.
Very House of Wax.
From late 70s. Great film. If you haven't seen it, really strange.
Really good. I think me and Brad talked about it when we were doing a kind of exploitation slasher folk horror type thing. It's great fun. Yeah. Amazing. Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Michael Blyth. What a fascinating conversation. There was so much more that we could have said, but I'd love to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? What would you like to add to this conversation? What do you think of these two Carpenter movies? Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode and anything horror related with fellow listeners, join the discussion group. That's called the Evolution of Horror Discussion Group, and that can be found on Facebook. You can find all previous episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply go to evolutionofhorror.com. If you want to support the making of this podcast, you can sign up to our Patreon channel. Simply go to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror and donate $5 a month for weekly bonus content and more. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Acast, Stitcher, Libsyn, and Spotify. And if you really want to support this podcast but you can't afford to donate to the Patreon, another way you can do that is to leave us a rating or review, particularly if you're an Apple Podcasts user. Every single review we get really helps the podcast get boosted in algorithms, which helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, next week, where do we go from here? We're on to part 14, and next week we're going a little bit more family friendly. I dare say we're even stepping away very slightly from the horror genre, although only very, very slightly. Next week it's going to be a sort of late 80s and early 90s witchy double bill, and these witch movies are, I suppose, one of them you could absolutely legitimately say is a kids movie, and the other one is, I guess, kind of a rom-com in a weird way. I'm going to be joined by two different guests, Josh Tonks and Louise Blaine, and we are going to be discussing The Witches of Eastwick from 1987, and then Nick Rogue's incredible adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches from 1990. Holy shit, it's going to be a good week. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.